Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I'm on with Dr. Matt Mouzakis. We're going to be talking about the principalities and powers in the New Testament, applying Michael Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview to the New Testament. There is just an endless amount of verses in the New Testament that reference this idea of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview and the sons of God. And we're going to be talking about that today. How are we doing today, Dr. Matt Mouzakis?
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me on, Zach. It's really good to be back on. I know that we talked a couple years ago about Satan and that, but yeah, it's great to be back on your channel, and I really enjoy it. You do some great work here.
Oh, I appreciate it. That's very kind of you to say. So you wrote, or you created, wrote, that's not a good way to say it, whatever. Technically, yeah, I guess co-wrote a book on the principalities and powers, basically your dissertation on the topic here, where you go over the basically Deuteronomy 32 worldview, very in depth about that, but you also talk about specifically three passages: Romans 13, 1 Peter, and then Revelation 13. And you basically take Michael Heiser's work and you apply it to those passages, but you also talk about almost an endless amount of other passages because the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is all over the New Testament. That was pretty crazy to read about, but we're going to talk about that today. Can you just give people a quick little summary of your book that you just published?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Dr. Michael Heiser. I think it was probably about 8 years ago, like when it came out. I read the book and it like absolutely blew my mind. I read the whole book in one day, and then that's a thick book. I absolutely loved it. It blew my mind about the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's something that has influenced me in my theology sense. And obviously he's got the footnotes and all the citations to like back up his content. And obviously people have different views on it, such as Dr. Walton and people like that. I tend to lean more toward the supernatural worldview of Michael Heiser. And so I've really, like, in this book, kind of taken his project of the unseen realm and um, looked at where other conversations it could lead to. I'm also very interested in Jesus and the empire studies, like Jesus versus like the kingdom of Rome or the kingdoms of this world, which tie very much into the Deuteronomy 32 worldview and Michael Heiser's work on the unseen realm. And so really in this book is the outflow of my dissertation of looking at the Deuteronomy 32 worldview and how it might impact some of these passages, such as Romans 13, 1 Peter chapter 2, the beginning of 1 Peter chapter 2, and Revelation 13, were the first two that I mentioned there from Romans and 1 Peter are often ones that are sometimes put out to prop up the goodness of government and active participation by even Christians in the government. And then Revelation 13, which is come out of Babylon, the empire's a beast, Antichrist, stuff like that, depending on what, I guess, eschatological view you fall into, can seem to be seemingly contradictory, depending on how you look at that. And I've quoted quite a few people in the book who see these as like, oh, well, maybe under Peter and Paul and Romans, these are good governments. And so with good governments, you should submit to them and be actively involved. But when they become evil, like the government in Revelation, or in a dispensational view, like our revitalization of the Roman Empire at the end times under the Antichrist or something like that, which I don't take a dispensational view whatsoever, that doesn't apply to the other two. So I take the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, try to apply it to all three, and see how they can cohesively work together within that point of view. So I really go through setting up how, in the book, how the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is a thing in the Old Testament, a worldview there, how in the Intertestament they held the same worldview, how in the New Testament and with Jesus even held that, and then into the epistles and Acts and all of that, how it flows through as a consistent meta narrative through the entire New Testament as well. So that was really what I set up.
Yeah.
And then I go through those 3 specific passages at the end of the book and kind of show how the Deuteronomy 32 worldview gives us some new lenses in which we can interpret these passages, where we see that there's these hostile powers that control systems in this world, and then there's the kingdom of God, which is very different and lives in a different way, and how the two should interact with one another.
Yeah, awesome. All right. So what about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview? People might not be aware of that. Could you just give us just the basics here? What is what is that idea?
Yeah. So Deuteronomy 32 worldview is based on Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, where Moses is recounting the story of the Tower of Babel. Is what I believe there. God disinherits the nations due to their rebellion, and God places an Elohim over each nation. And eventually, I believe that these Elohim lead the nations astray, pervert justice. You can kind of see that in Psalm 82. And though this was maybe a harsh punishment to humanity, God has plans through Abraham, through Israel, and now the church to re-inherit the people from these nations, bring them back into the kingdom of God. Michael Heiser has a quote that describes the biblical narrative this way. It says, "From the fateful decision at Babel onward, the story of the Old Testament is about Israel versus the disinherited nations, and Yahweh versus the corrupt rebel Elohim of those nations. The division of these nations and their allotment under the Elohim is behind the scenes in all sorts of places in biblical history."
Very fascinating. So one of these days, we're going to have to do a really in-depth view of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. But in the meantime, we're going to be talking about the New Testament. So what was really fascinating to me, and it really shows that Dr. Michael Heiser really did a good job pointing out things that people have missed, or at least referencing people that the lay people are just not aware of, referencing scholarship that people are not aware of. So one of these examples is the word archonton and archai in Romans 8:38, 1 Corinthians 15:24, Ephesians 1:21. It's all over the New Testament. Colossians 1:16, 2:10, 2:15. Paul uses these words to refer to rulers, but this isn't just like some normal human ruler. A lot of times, at least, it's not just talking about some guy over a nation. You're arguing that it's more than that, that there's a supernatural element here. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think most of these passages, when you look in scholarship, they don't really dispute that they're supernatural in nature, I guess, to these rulers. So archon is in the plural, and it's interchangeable with arche, which you mentioned. So in First Enoch, chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, it describes the fallen watchers there with these terms. The evil watchers are identified both in the singular and in the plural in First Enoch 8, verses 1. In addition, Michael, who is one of what they call the plural archonton, in Daniel 10:13, according to Theodoret, his rendering there shows these spiritual beings used with the same language. Then you even have the term archontes, which is used in 1 Corinthians 2:6. It's really, some say that these are human authorities because it's the same term that's used in Romans 13, verses 3. But it's also used, if you look in the Septuagint, in Daniel 10:21 and 12:1 for hostile spiritual powers. Now, many will say, depending on the context, it can be one or the other. I think that when you use the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and you and I talked about this before we went live here at recording, where you look back in, kind of the debated texts of whether this is the king of Babylon or the king of Tyre, or is it like the Satan or the Adam figure in those verses in Isaiah and Ezekiel. And I argue that it's an overlap in the book between the king of Tyre and the Satan, the deceiver figure, and the king of Babylon, the Satan figure. And I think both in Romans 13 and in 1 Corinthians 2, where it says that the powers are coming to nothing, or the rulers are coming to nothing, there in 1 Corinthians 2:6, that it's an overlap between the governmental empires of this world, their rulers, and the Deuteronomy 32, the rulers that are over them. So Yoder and Mao, who are two scholars also that deal kind of with this, come to the same conclusion that these powers and these phrases should be seen as overlapping.
Very fascinating. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 2:6, you say, or the verse says, "We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing." So, if you're not very familiar with how this word is used, you could easily interpret this as just some guy that Paul's referring to that's in charge of Rome.
In the area, yep.
Right. Or in the area, right, a public area. So, so that really changes how we look at a lot of these different texts here. And as you said, one, it's interesting that it references the book of Enoch here, or maybe not here specifically, but at least
the same word is used in the book
words.
of Enoch. Same word is used in Daniel in the Septuagint. Yep. So
okay, that's a better way to say it. It's a better way to say powers.
Yeah.
So it has a maybe not a contextual idea of like people maybe not, when they were writing this, we're not going to say, hey, we're thinking of Enoch or the book of Daniel, although it's possible, but at least how the word is used in that time period.
Yeah, the cultural river will then, as John Walton says it, often will help us define those words. And the words within the Septuagint, within Enoch in the intertestamental literature, pointed to both physical rulers in our realm, like could be a governor or the Caesar or whatever, or it could be the spiritual powers. And I think that the Deuteronomy 32 worldview sees those, and I show that throughout the book, of how those powers overlap, that essentially the rulers and principalities, spiritual powers, the hostile powers are pulling the strings behind the systems.
I see. Yeah, so this one makes
it the animating powers.
Yeah, Romans 8:38 kind of makes it more obvious here. It's death and life, that's a whole nother topic, but angels is obviously going to have divine elements, and then heavenly rulers makes it obviously clear. So just for my audience, so do you think that Paul in Romans 8:38 is referring to just like some type of heavenly being out there that's ruling in heaven, or referring to divine beings that are ruling on earth? What do you think there?
I definitely think that it's divine beings there, because even when you get into the nor things present or nor things to come, nor powers or heights or depths, when you look kind of into the background of all of those things, they did have cultural language which tied them to either astral deities or these things behind life, behind death. He defines that then with angels or demons, things present and future. They're talking about the fates there, where they would see that these things are kind of controlling fates at some point, and fates in the classical sense, not in the Calvinistic sense. Nor height nor depth. Those looked at the heavenlies and the underworld, which was also in like Roman mythology. And things present and future, they saw them controlling sovereigns, I guess you could say, at the same time. But it says that none of those things in the pagan mindset can actually separate us from God.
Oh wow.
So, yeah. So he's contrasting the pagan mindset of these principalities and powers that they saw controlling things
Yeah.
with like truly Jesus, which dynamis, the word powers there. We see that not only in Romans 8:38, but also in Ephesians 1:21, 1 Corinthians 15:24, 2 Thessalonians 1:7. And these instances also include angels in the spiritual world, and combine it with rulers, which was the last word we looked at, arche, and the final eschatological judgment, where every power, not merely human powers, are being judged.
Very nice. Very nice. All right. So this same passage uses another similar word. Paul uses the word dynamis, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, powers. Yep.
Yeah, powers, and it's also used in Ephesians 1:21, 1 Corinthians 15:24, 2 Thessalonians 1:7. So tell us a little bit about this word.
Yeah. So I mentioned it a little bit, that it's like in all these cases, some of them point to like eschatological judgment, like the end of the world. And at the final judgment, there with all these things, it's not only human rulers or humans being judged at the end, but it's the powers being judged as well in these contexts. So,
Oh wow, that's fascinating. Okay.
so I think again, it proves the overlap.
Okay. So just for clarity, just for my audience here and myself. So when in a passage like this, at least Romans 8, do you think that Paul is referring to divine powers only, human powers and divine powers, or
Um,
how is he understanding that?
Here, I mean, I think it could be an overlap, but I think that because he uses angels and heavenly rulers,
Yeah.
that and these things that tie into the fates, like I said, that he's probably got his main focus on those things, even though there was an overlap, because they saw sometimes the rulers such as Caesar as embodying the gods or whatever, or as the representative of the gods at times. So.
Okay, fascinating. All right. So let's flip to Romans 13, which is one of the passages that you wrote a lot of work on in your dissertation and your book that people can check out in the description. I would highly, highly recommend a really, really awesome, detailed book.
Yes, thank you.
I'll go ahead and read chapter 13, 1-7, and you can tell us what it's saying here. So it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except by God's appointment, and the authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So the person who resists such authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers cause no fear for good conduct, but for bad. Do you desire not to fear authority? Do good, and you will receive its condemnation, because it is God's servant for your well-being. But be afraid if you do wrong, because of government does not bear the sword for nothing. It is God's servant to administer punishment on the person who does wrong. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of the wrath of the authorities, but also because of your conscience. For this reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants devoted to governing. Pay everyone what is owed, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due." So, could you talk about, I guess, the context of this passage and any background context about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview?
Yeah. So Romans, I think often in more reformed traditions have seen Romans as a lot of like a systematic theology book, like putting forth doctrine and things like that. And I believe that Paul is spelling some of that out, but it's not for the purpose of just putting forth doctrine. There is Paul, I think at heart, he's an apostle, but he's also pastoring this church. We can see like later in the letter that a lot of the issues that are going on here and like his focus is between what he calls the weak and the strong. There's this Jew and Gentile division. We see that he also wants to start this mission to Spain. And so, like, what's going on there? Like, how can he truly have a gospel mission to Spain when the church that he wants to launch it out of is not actually living out the gospel in unity? And so he's dealing with all these like unity issues within the church. And I think that that's Paul's primary perspective, rather than teaching doctrines of salvation or election or any of these things. That Paul is trying to communicate like who these people are in Christ and what that means to live together, and live as a community as lights to the world. Even right from the beginning of Romans, we get this where Paul is declaring the gospel in the first couple of verses of this gospel of Jesus being Christ, Jesus being Lord, which are all royal titles, which would like kind of like slap Caesar in the face. He's the Davidic ruler. He's also like anointed by the Spirit, all these things. And Paul is calling Gentiles to the obedience of the faith. There's a whole lot of things going on at the beginning, and that's the gospel he's not ashamed of, is that Jesus is king and Caesar is not. And so even after that, he kind of goes into talking about that humanity forsaked their glory, which I think is an echo back to Psalm 8, which is the image of God. God crowned humanity with glory, even though they're a little lower than the angels or lower than the Elohim, and and had them rule over creation. This glory theme is a thread that goes all throughout Romans. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They've fallen short of this image vocation that they're supposed to be. I know you've had quite a few people come on and talk about the image of God on your channel and how that is like image bearing status, image bearing vocation. And so that's behind a lot of Paul's work here in Romans as well, seeing that both Jew and Gentile, created in the image of God, have this this calling to be representatives of Christ, ambassadors, vocationally here in Rome. So that's kind of, I think, a little bit of the background there. Like, if we want to like set up a little bit of the Deuteronomy 32 stuff in there, we see at the end that when they live this out, that the God of peace will crush Satan, the Satan under their feet. That definitely ties in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview.
Oh, wow.
But also, like in Romans chapter 1, 3 times within Romans chapter 1, he uses the same word as the Deuteronomy 32. In Deuteronomy 32 is when God hands the nations, or basically hands over the nations to the Elohim, in chapter 1, using the exact same words. There is when they forsake the glory of the invisible God and worship things made of wood, stone, and all of that, that God hands them over, and it leads to the hardening of their hearts, the depraving of their minds, the corruption, all this stuff, leading to death. So death throughout Romans actually and sin become this powers. N.T. Wright says that death and sin, when you read death and sin in Romans, that you should see that as a capital D and a capital S, that these are powers that rule over people, that they have been given dominion, that they're slaves to them. It's like this Exodus motif where Christ comes and he frees them through his death. Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 6 is about baptism, leads them through the Red Sea. Romans chapter 7 is about the law. Romans chapter 8 leads to this like new creation where through the revealing of the sons of God, creation is freed from its bondage. So you have this progression of being freed out from under the powers. And so that's kind of the way I see it, which Paul has a parenthesis in Romans 9 through 11 about the vocation of Israel. And then we get to Romans 12 and 13 after that. So this is all leading up to that. So Romans 12 is really directed just to like straight at the church of how they're to live in the world. And if you read the end of Romans 12, it's pretty much Paul is echoing like the entire Sermon on the Mount, like way of life, like turn the other cheek, like, feed your enemies, like all that type of stuff. Live in peace with those around you the best that you can, because there's this mindset that a lot of people see because of the situation that the Christians are in Rome, and even maybe even prophetically the persecution that's about to come on them after this, shortly after this with Nero, of the mindset that they're supposed to take within that situation. And so I think you can't read Romans 13 without reading Romans 12. Romans 12 is the behavior of the Christians. And if it doesn't line up with Romans 13, like, the two aren't really exactly aren't juxtaposed to each other, but like, it's really hard to live out Romans 13 and Romans 12 at the same time. Is what I found. It's like, if you read, the two are supposed to like contrast each other. So I think what Paul's issues are, which we can see a little bit in Romans chapter 2, is that there's this mindset of almost like zealotous behavior of rising up. Like, he talks to them about looting temples and ripping people off and stuff like that, which isn't the way of Christ. And so when we get to Romans 13, and that, then it really kind of gets into, I think you have to compare it to Romans 12. I think that I'll stop there and see if you have any questions for me before I keep going.
Yeah, well, just for my audience, can you make that explicit? So Romans 13 is on the screen. What specific phrases or words are you talking about that that you say they kind of mirror each other, or they're the same context?
Yeah. So let's look at every person be subject to the governing authorities. So that governing the authorities there is that word that's connected, even the overlap with the principalities and powers.
Mm-hmm.
So there, to be subject, in the translation that you have up there, is the word hupotasso, which even in some translations say to obey, which it's hupotasso is really, I would say, and I mean, if you look at any of our major lexicons, would be, I think, better translated as voluntarily yield yourself. So voluntarily put yourself under these powers. I think it's for the sake of witness, which is kind of all about this. I think Paul is not putting forth like a full like church state doctrine here, but I think the small Christian community in Rome, he's trying to like squelch some of their zealotous maybe mindsets that could be in there. And you can kind of see this in some of the words in previous chapters, in order so they basically won't be killed. I think that he's just trying to keep them from getting killed. So I mean, that's my opinion. That's the opinion of some other scholars as well. Ben Witherington very much takes that view as well. So after that, it says there's no authority except from what God has appointed. This also points to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. God was the one who appointed these principalities and powers at the disinheriting of the nations, right? It doesn't mean that it's not essentially a good thing. It's just that God did it. I think these Elohim went astray, but it's the same thing. God delegated authority to them. All authority exists because God instituted it. Yeah, I agree with that. Even though God delegated to these Elohim, these rulers did not use it in the way that maybe God intended them to do. So a person who resists such authority resists the ordinances of God. All right, they're going to incur judgment from these rulers when they resist them. For rulers cause no fear for good conduct, but for bad. So this is kind of interesting because, I mean, Paul, like, you know, like his whole thing at the end of 2 Corinthians, like where he kind of did resist authority and got beaten all the time, you know,
right.
Like, and I mean, Peter and all them got thrown in jail. Like most of the disciples were crucified because they resisted authority. Peter even says in Acts that we must obey God and not necessarily human authority. And it's not a call that we resist that, but I think it's voluntarily yield is the better translation of subject at the top there, where we voluntarily yield for the sake of the kingdom where things line up. If it doesn't disobey the commands of God, then yeah, if it doesn't disobey the kingdom, or go against the rule of God, then sure, yeah. After that, it says, "Do good, and you will be commended, because the servant is for your well-being." That God's servant there is a very interesting thing, because that servant there is the same word that we have in the New Testament as deacon, which I think is really fascinating. But also, all throughout the Old Testament, even pagan nations were called God's servants, because he would use them at different times to bring about his justice. So is God just using, not necessarily saying these nations or this governmental structure is necessarily good, but that he's using it as a tool? We see instances of Assyria and Babylon and all of that in the Old Testament being used by God as a tool. But even when it says, when we talk about there's no authority except for God, back in Hosea, I think it's really interesting. Something that might even kind of push against this a little bit is that God, when Israel starts setting up kings, it says that you've set up kings and princes, but not ones I've known, meaning that God did not approve them. And even First Samuel, when they select Paul as king, God says explicitly that they reject God by putting kings in place. So this kind of pushes against like the Christian notion of the Christians need to necessarily be involved in this type of stuff, because we do have a king, and that is Christ. So I guess I'll pause there and see if you have any questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. You said Paul, by the way. You meant Saul.
Sorry,
King
Saul. Yeah.
Yeah.
Saul. Sorry, Saul. Paul.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's helpful. So just for people's clarity here, if you could just sum up what Paul is arguing here in just a few sentences, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think that Paul is like, his main thing here isn't setting up like a whole like doctrine of church and state. Here we have a government in this passage in the original culture that isn't very much like ours today. Maybe some would argue that it is, but we have the Roman Empire, and we have most of these Christians are probably slaves, or even Gentile slaves, or even some Gentile, some those who are rich and free. It's a multi-ethnic church who's trying to find their way in the midst of empire. And I think the local context is really important here. We know from archaeology there's like 3 or 4 different neighborhoods in around the time of Augustus. He divided up the whole empire into different neighborhoods, and it wasn't necessarily like Roman police or any of that would oversee these. They would set up what was called vico magistrates, where essentially a homeowners association president over all these different neighborhoods. And so, but in the middle of the neighborhood, there was this neighborhood shrine that was called the Lars Augusti. So in the middle of that, and it was kind of the way that they paid their homeowners association dues. It might have been a little bit of tribute to the empire, but at the same time, it went towards crime prevention, police upkeep, all of that. At the time that the Jews, after Claudius's edict, and then Nero reversed it, and the Jews were allowed to come back into Rome, there was this double tax that went on. And so I think that that's kind of the thing behind maybe some of these taxes, is those who might have already paid the tax and then got kicked out had to repay it when they came back in. So there's some evidence for that. And even what this Lars Augusti might have meant for those who paid tribute only to Christ and did not want to pay this tax because they thought it was an honor to the emperor. I think Paul is telling them to stay low, to be good neighbors, essentially. And so that's kind of what I'm wrestling with, I guess, a little bit in this passage, is where some want to make this clearly about church and state and take it out of its local neighborhood context. And that's why I call this passage Trouble in the Neighborhood, where it's really about a conversation within these neighborhoods in Rome rather than a full-blown governmental context. Because the exact same word that they were using for those rulers and authorities, though they could have seen them connected to Caesar and the powers behind Caesar, were also used of these local homeowners association presidents, you might say. And so I think it's really interesting. I spell it out more in the book there of what it could mean. But I think that really when it comes to the end is like, if we take it about government, you have to square it with the way Christians are called to live in Romans 12, because Paul uses distance language of they and them in Romans 13 and you and us in Romans 12, which is very much in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of, the people of God and the people under the powers. So
appreciate it. Alrighty. So next passage here, Romans 13. That's what we just talked about. Let's talk about Revelation 13. So,
yeah.
Or as the cool kids say, Revelations.
Yeah, Revelations.
Revelations. Revelations. Oh gosh, I'm doing it. Revelation 13. So 13, 1-7, I'll read it real quick. So it says,
Yep.
Then I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadem crowns, and on its heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast that I saw was like a leopard, but its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. The dragon gave the beast his power, his throne, and great authority to rule. One of the beast's heads appeared to have been killed, but the lethal wound had been healed, and the whole world followed the beast in amazement. They worshipped the dragon because he had given ruling authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast too, saying, Who is like the beast, and who is able to make war against him? The beast was given a mouth speaking proud words and blasphemies, and he was permitted to exercise ruling authority for 42 months. So the beast opened his mouth to blaspheme against his God, against God, to blaspheme both his name and his dwelling place, that is, those who dwell in heaven. The beast was permitted to go to war against the saints and conquer them. He was given ruling authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So we do see a lot of authority, ruling language.
Mm-hmm.
Could you do the same thing here? What would you say is just like the real simple background context of this passage, and also how does that have to do with Deuteronomy 32?
Yeah. So I think kind of the background, I mean, obviously there's a lot of different interpretations of the book of Revelation. Steve Gregg has an awesome, like, 4 views commentary on it. I think some of my favorite books on Revelation are Michael Gorman's book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, Scott McKnight's Revelation for the Rest of Us. Those are 2 of my favorites. Obviously, Beale's huge commentary on Revelation is great as well. But I think really, like, when we're looking at that Revelation, I think we need to interpret it in its first century context like any other, instead of just seeing it as futuristic. I go through and argue for that perspective in the book, that these 7 churches were literally 7 churches in Asia Minor. This message had to mean something for them in the first century, whether you take an early date or a late date. I think there's a lot of evidence of the background of this being about these 7 churches and the empire, or Babylon, it might say, seeping into these churches, and Christ is calling them to faithfulness to him and his kingdom, which really ties into this Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and also kind of the political, view of being exiles in the midst of a nation, in the midst of empire, which I trace all throughout the Old Testament and through the New Testament in my book as well. So I think the occasion here is that he's writing to these 7 churches. He's calling them to faithfulness, to imitate, basically to follow the Lamb, is what it says throughout this book, that these people, who are every tribe, tongue, and nation, which is represented as the 144,000, I believe, is because John uses this thing throughout Revelation of seeing and hearing. So like John hears a roaring lion, but he sees a lamb. It's the interpretation of it. He hears a census of 144,000, but he sees every tribe, tongue, and nation worshiping around the throne. The seeing is the interpretation of what he hears. It's not two separate images, but it's what he does. So these 144,000 are representative of every tribe and tongue and nation who are worshiping and following the Lamb. This is they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. So it's just a representative of the people. Babylon is another image that comes up. Revelation 17 and 18 are really, I guess, kind of clear on this I think of who it is. It's a great city who's on 7 hills, seems like Rome. And it goes into, and even if you look like in the early church, Sibylline oracles, 4th Ezra, a couple of places in 4th Ezra all describe this as in the same way of Babylon as Rome. And early church as well. Tertullian says it multiple times. Hippolytus, Victorinus. So McKnight pulls all those out in his book. But Revelation 17 and 18 really point to some of the characteristics of Babylon that have been seeping into the church that they need to avoid in mindsets. Is Revelation 17:3 says that Babylon is anti-God. 17:4 shows that they're opulent. 17:6 is they're murderous. 18:7 is that they're image focused. They're focused on their image of kind of Babylon first type imagery, that they're the greatest, they're militaristic. 17:13, they are exploitive economically. In 18:3, they're arrogant. In Revelation 18:7 and 17:3, and I think that's really what John is kind of get at, these attitudes that are seeping into the church. So when we get into this passage, I think it's kind of interesting because we have a whole Deuteronomy 32 background even going into this, where Revelation 12 depicts kind of this cosmic battle between the dragon and God's people, which the dragon is very depictive of, the ancient Leviathan, which is very connected to that divine council worldview. But yeah, let's dig in, I guess, to a lot of the verses that you just mentioned there. In Revelation 13, like starting off the top here, it said the beast coming out of the sea, so the first half of Revelation 13 is about, there's 2 different beasts in Revelation 13. The first beast comes out of the sea in kind of Old Testament imagery represented the Gentiles. It represented chaos, and that the 10 horns and 7 heads and crowns and blasphemous names all echoes back to Daniel. Kind of the images of all the different creatures that are connected with this echo back to Daniel 7, and the creatures that the Son of Man eventually defeats, the different nations. So all of these beasts from Daniel 7 connected to that show that the beast here is an empire, but it's not only an empire, it's given power by Satan, is what it says, by the dragon who's connected to Satan. And it's not only given power, but it has these horns on its head. So it's depicted of rulers as well. It's given the authority to rule. So I guess I'll pause there and see do you have any questions?
So what you're saying is, maybe you can get to it. Whatever authority is in question here, I would either Rome or Nero or whatever you want to say there. Seems like Satan in this text is saying
empowering it.
Yeah, Satan is empowering that ruler. So Paul and whoever wrote Revelation,
John the Apostle, John the Elder, John the Seer.
Yeah, right. Or even even if you don't even go that route, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whoever wrote this is basically saying that Satan gave the ruler in question here, which was probably, well, maybe not probably, but uh, I mean, there's a whole question of like if the
Hmm.
whoever's writing this is alive at the time of Nero,
Yeah.
or if he thinks
Or
that there's
whether
like,
they're reflecting back on Nero.
yeah,
Yeah.
whatever, whatever Nero was. So basically,
Yeah.
saying that Nero was empowered by Satan,
Yeah.
and
I think
yeah, that's
so.
very
And I
consistent with the divine council of
divine
30.
council worldview. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
wow.
Because Satan, in their view, in the second temple, is eventually like God handed these nations over. Deuteronomy 32, Tower of Babel. Um, Eventually, in the intertestamental worldview, their view is like, all right, so they need a leader,
Hmm.
which is this Satan figure who rules them. And so it's the same like here, like all of these nations, these kings that are under the fallen Elohim are empowered by these spiritual forces that are behind it. It's the animating force behind empire.
Hmm. Yeah.
and and so I think Revelation 13 picks up on that um there. So
Yeah, that's something. So on that same note, I know you kind of stopped halfway through, but uh, what conversation does this have with, I guess, for people today? Isn't there some kind of debate about like if we should? No one would say that we should follow this figure, the beast, right?
mhm.
So what's that conversation?
Yeah, I think that the main issue was when you go through and study like those seven churches in Revelation at the
Mm,
very front of the book in chapters 2 and 3 is most of them are having issues with caving into the mindset and the of Babylon. So there's definitely an issue there in the churches that Jesus is calling out, and there's some that are being persecuted that are being faithful for holding tight to His way, and even some that aren't caving into Babylon, but their love has grown cold. So like Ephesus, and at the beginning of chapter 2, which I think that's their love growing cold towards one another because they're so steeped in culture wars, probably. Um, and so that's like Jesus's warnings to the church here. But here I think that there's a few things that like stick out to me, which is like the fatal like wound that's healed. And some have said that when Nero committed suicide in on June 9th of 68 AD, that there were kind of a two like historical things at play. The first was that the Judeo-Claudian line like had ended with him, and that there was no successor. And so then the second thing was it ended up being like this big civil war over power in Rome, and it seemed like that basically Rome was over because there was no successor, and all these people were fighting over power. Um, Kenneth Gentry says it this way: immediately, the Roman Empire was hurled into civil wars of great ferocity and of dynamic proportions. In fact, civil wars almost destroyed the empire, seriously threatening to reduce eternal Rome to rubble. The peril that Rome faced in the upheaval shook so much that they had not known it in any other era. Um, After that, eventually, like it was kind of the year of the three emperors, and as like Vespasian came to the throne, it was said through a whole bunch of Roman poets that it was if Rome had been resurrected. So, which was kind of interesting that they were raised from the dead, which yeah, I think it is, and I think that that's where we might even get the what they call the Nero redivivus myth, like
hmm.
the Nero resurrected. So whether you take an early date or a late date, some people point to like the 666 as Nero, um, or this whole head wound, uh, as if dead but revived thing of the beast. Um, some if you take a late date, it's the like Nero revitivist myth, where they thought that Nero didn't actually die, but he went off to the east and then he's coming back. But others would say that kind of that the Caesars after that, like almost like embodied the spirit of Nero, is the way that the church saw it with the like persecutions and stuff like that.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, but this is pretty explicit. Like, hey,
Yeah.
we're not supposed to be following this guy.
Yeah. I mean, even throughout Revelation, there's even sexual imagery that John, I'm just gonna call him John uses of come out of her and don't like participate in her plagues, which it's like, hey, you're in bed with, they even call Babylon the harlot riding the beast, you know? Yeah.
Not a children's book. That's okay.
No, not a children's book.
Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to add about Revelation 13 before we get going?
No. I think we got through some of that stuff there. Obviously, I go into way more in the book. We can't get through everything in this interview.
Yeah, we'll be here all day. Another really interesting one is Kyriotetes, or however you pronounce that, Lords, Colossians 1:16, Ephesians 1:21. What significance does this have as far as Deuteronomy 32 or supernatural powers?
Yeah, let me pull my notes quick on that.
Reminder to check out Dr. Mouzakis' book in the description, as well as his YouTube channel that him and Dr. Will Ryan, who's also been on the channel, they manage, and they have talk about all kinds of Deuteronomy 32 worldview stuff, women in ministry, all kinds of other different topics as well.
Yeah, lots of topics. Yeah, so Kyriotes, Lords is usually what it's translated as. So this occurs a couple times in Paul's epistles. We have it in Colossians 1:16. We have it in Ephesians 1:21. I think the supernatural context of it, though some debate it, is found in Ephesians 1:21. So spiritual beings, I don't think can be excluded from Colossians 1:16, because Paul is referring to all of creation, all things visible or invisible, whether thrones. So that's another word that's often used, throni, there for spiritual powers, or dominions, kuriotes, or rulers, archai, or authorities, exousiai. Thus, I think that it can be considered that these phrases connect with an overlap of the spiritual powers and the powers of the state. And I think based on, Paul has another phrase called domains of darkness, which you see, I think 2 or 3 verses earlier here in Colossians, which talks about being transferred out of the domain of darkness and into the kingdom of God's Son. Colossians 1:13. And I think scholars have often, as I've read, proposed that the Hebrew version of this word was also used for that domain of darkness to be the dominion of Belial, which is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1QS 118, 1QS 219, 1QM 14:9, 18:1, 4Q 286, and 287, which is what most scholars argue is the equivalent of this Kyriotes word as well. So I think it can be suggested that when you connect it with arche and exousia, which we've seen in our conversation earlier today, can be connected to the Septuagint, meaning spiritual powers or celestial beings. I think that we can easily make the connections that there's this overlap in this word as well of lords, kuriotes.
Fascinating. That Belial reference is really interesting. You maybe they're not. Paul isn't specifically referencing the Qumran community, but
but he
at
uses
least
it, and
his idea of this way of thought, essentially.
it's kind of like a domain versus domain of Jesus versus the domain of the world under the powers. Where when he uses lords there, which when he uses that word, well, kurios is the word Lord that they often use for Jesus in the Bible, but when they use the kuriotes, lords in plural, I think that he's often either referring to these principalities and powers or the ones who are animating the lords, quote unquote, of this world, the Caesars.
Fascinating. All right. What about this daemonion, demons in 1 Corinthians 8:5? How does that have relevance here?
Yeah. So I think it has the same trajectory of kind of that kuriotes, kurioi stuff. So in 1 Corinthians 8:5, he says that there are many gods and many lords, which is interesting, which comes right off the tails of saying that that he's talking about food sacrifice, that there's no God but one, and he's talking about for there are also no so-called gods. People kind of get tripped up on that, and some will even say like and use that to throw against kind of this Deuteronomy 32 worldview, being like, hey, see, Paul doesn't believe that there are other gods. I think he contradicts that just following that whether in heaven or on earth, indeed there are many so-called gods and many demonia, so many lords, kuriotes. So he calls these demons, essentially. I think it's a connection back to Deuteronomy 32, verse 17. I think that's his point of reference there, which directly connects to that Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where there are nations outside of Israel that are under the rule of spiritual powers. Let me pull that up. Or if you want to also Deuteronomy 32:17.
Yeah, I got you. They sacrificed to demons, not God, to gods they had not known, to new gods who had recently come along, gods your ancestors had not known about.
Yeah, so they sacrificed to demons, it says there. And the Septuagint, which is interesting, uses demonion. And the LES, so the Lexham English Septuagint, it just calls it deities rather than demons. So I think these demons, deities can have some overlap. I know that the guys from the Lord of Spirits podcast, Dr. Andrew Stephen Damick, Father Andrew Stephen Damick, and Father Stephen DeYoung talk about this as kind of a overlap of with spiritual beings rather than just demons. So yeah, the Septuagint translates shadim, which is the Hebrew word, as demonion, and the use of kuriotes in 1 Corinthians 8:5, I think Paul links, like I said, to this verse here. Not saying that they aren't real, but that they're not their gods, because you're called to, if you go back to the first Corinthians 8, that you're to have one God and one Lord. It's in contrast. So I think that Paul is using this this phrase here pejoratively as so-called demons, not saying that they don't exist, but the language actually reflects maybe some contempt towards them instead. Maybe similar expressions. There are similar expressions used of other writers in the Second Temple. I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. I can't remember, but I remember reading quite a few there. That so I think Paul embraces this view of shadim being more similar maybe to Elohim, kind of just spiritual being, which it can be used either as demons or just a spiritual being, I think. But usually, like anytime that this word is used, it's not used of like good spiritual beings like angels or those who work for Yahweh, but ones who are hostile.
I appreciate that. So just for some clarity here, where do you get the idea that Paul's referencing these other gods and lords as demons, daimonion.
Yeah, it's the verse that we looked at in Deuteronomy 32:17 in the Septuagint. It
Okay.
uses the same word there when it talks God as gods in that one, lowercase gods as the same word theos, theon, theoi in
Mm,
plural. But it talks about when it says you sacrifice to demons. The second verse after that, to gods you have not known, it's doing like a Hebrew parallelism.
mhm,
So it's interpreting what he meant by demons is that these are gods that aren't your God.
hmm. So does Paul in First Corinthians 8, does he use the word daimonion?
I believe he does. Let me pull that up first here. I think core 8. What verse we got there? 8. Was it?
Yeah, First Corinthians 8. But I mean, I have in my notes that daimonion is in reference here, but
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly where that reference was.
Yeah, let me I think we can surface 8 5. Go- Gods, many gods who well, lords is curios, many called gods.
Yeah.
Um yeah, it's connected to like the worship of idols, um and sacrificing to demons there, which he connects more to actually in chapter 10 as well in First Corinthians, where he talks about
Okay.
food
Yeah.
sacrifice to idols,
Right.
where you
Right.
have
Right.
fellowship with demons or fellowship with God. So that's the connection there, because he's
Okay.
connecting. He does a parentheses in First Corinthians 9, but when you get there, either you have fellowship, koinonia with God, or koinonia with demons, essentially. So
Yeah.
that's the word there. Yeah. And so when he's connecting with earlier is gods, uses essentially the same word theos
Mm.
there to mean false gods, which connects back to Deuteronomy 32 17, where it talks about shadim, demons, and gods in the same verse.
Much appreciated. All right.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that that's a good little explanation there. So I think we might have already talked about this a little bit, but the exousia, the
Hmm.
authorities used in First Corinthians 15, 24, Ephesians 1:21, 2:2, 3:10, 6:12, Colossians 1:16, 2:10, 2:15. So it's used all over the place. Tell us
Yeah,
about this
27
word.
times.
What is the relevance here for this discussion?
Yeah, so I think exousia, authorities, is the most frequent term used by Paul for supernatural powers, 27 times. It's often used in tandem with a whole bunch of those other terms that we've already gone through in this episode of the New Testament, like you mentioned a whole bunch of the verses. So Paul uses this also as human authorities, Romans 13, as we already mentioned. Um, and I think we should see it as kind of an overlap of human and spiritual authorities. The testimony in the intertestamental period, the Testament of Levi, 3:8 uses this word along with thrones, which we saw, throni, in another verse, to look at the presence of God and when God delegates his authority to divine council members, which is interesting. He connects this with thrones. Um, whether thrones or authorities or rulers or powers, we saw back in, I think it was Colossians. Uh, we do see this in First Enoch, chapter 61, Second Baruch, chapter 12, where God delegates his authority to angels. We see it in the New Testament, in Revelation, chapter 6, chapter 9. God also gives delegation language in the Septuagint, in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 10, which intertwines these human and supernatural powers. Um, what I've seen is that scholars propose that when Paul uses these terms here, um, more often than others, and also in the Second Temple writers and the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran, that they see these words as those who have been granted authority by someone else. We see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls for Belial in 1QM, when he delegates his authority to the spirits of his lot. So that's 1QM4 and column 2 and 13, 2 through 5 and 12 in the Dead Sea Scrolls there. So there's a whole lot of evidence that this can mean like delegated authority or just someone who has authority, but it's often when it's used as like a title, kind of as Paul used it, the authorities, is often combined with an overlap of spiritual powers and powers in this world.
It's very fascinating. What about, this is a really fun one, the cosmocratores tus scutos tutu, however you pronounce that. That's just the English transliteration.
Cosmic rulers of this darkness.
Yeah, that's a really cool one. So Ephesians 6:12.
Yeah, that's the only time that it's used in the New Testament when he uses this term, but it is used in the Testament of Solomon 8:2 and 18:2. And it's used of demons there. It's described of demons there. So, and it's used when Paul uses it in Ephesians 6:12. It is in conjunction with the plural arches, so rulers, and exousias, authorities, which really would reflect that Old Testament notion of the world that's under the dominion of hostile gods. So BDAG takes this term, that's a lexicon there for you, of the world ruling spirits, they say, or the spirits who have parts of the cosmos under their control when they use those terms.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. What's interesting about a lot of these words is they're used a lot in the same context, or it's almost like Paul wants to.
They overlap. Yeah, he intermixes all of them to kind of mean the same thing. Like he just kind of piles them on to like prove his point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So this is another example of that. So we got a couple more here. What about the stoicheia, the elementals? So there's a lot of debate about this one. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a ton of debate on this one. So kind of the way that I see it is, so stoicheia, kind of that Greek lemma, can refer to four things, and Heiser has shown this also in a lot of his work, is it can mean really the basic principles of like religious teaching. So the Torah, the law, that's one. Second can be like rudimentary, substances of the physical world. So, the earth, wind, sky, like all the like things like that. The elements of the physical world can be what some call the stoicheia. The third way it can be described is astral deities, astrological myths, things about the stars, The fourth way is spiritual beings. And I think that the first three can be kind of maybe even assumed within the fourth way. And I think I'll kind of get to that here in a minute. So Hebrews 5:12, I think, is a good place to start, where it clearly refers to religious teachings of the law. But even within Hebrews, it talks about the angels were the ones mediating, or the spiritual beings were the ones mediating the law. So you kind of get that under like the fourth view of when you get the law within the first notion of stoicheia. The second is things of the physical world, and within really like kind of the mindset of the first century is behind like everything in the cosmos, there was a god for it, in the pagan mindset. So there's like behind the sun, there's this. Behind your crops, there's something. But so that's kind of like all the mindset is all these things in the world don't operate necessarily on their own. There's a God that's tied to it. And that's why, like, even in Acts 17, where they had a God for everything, and Paul said they even made an idol or an altar to an unknown God in case they missed anything. Then the third thing is really we got astral deities, astrological myths. We see all throughout the Bible the sons of God being called like the morning stars and the heavenly hosts and things like that. They had this view of the stars were essentially the gods up there, you know? So I think that we can kind of like connect all of those together. Now, while there's really no consensus of it, I think that 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10 and verse 12, it refers to stoicheia there, really to kind of the elements of the physical world, like I said. But I think it really ties it into like systems as well. Not only the physical things, but the systems that these Elohim control. Other than that, I think regarding stoicheia, I think it's helpful to, even when we approach its use in Colossians 2, verse 8 and 20, the context there seemed to be really about pagan deity worship or the worship of divine beings that have the power over the basic elements of the material world, and also pagan asceticism. So I think that we can see really, like, when we use this word stoicheia, I think pretty much all the different aspects of it, even in the biblical text, can be connected back to spiritual beings and some source kind of at the root of it as the elementals.
Interesting. Galatians 4:3 is a fun one. It says, so also we, when we were children under the basic principles, stoicheia, of the world, were held in bondage.
Yep.
So that's a fun one.
That kind of ties into the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, or you're under bondage under the principalities and powers. And the whole thing of Christ setting us free, bringing us out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his beloved son, as it talks about in Colossians.
Yeah, it's interesting because this word is just slightly, just a little vague, so you can interpret it in a number of different ways.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like an umbrella term that's used in a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah. All right. So 1 Peter 2:13-17. This was another really big one that you wrote about. Could you give us the little basic context of this, as well as the Deuteronomy 32 idea?
Yeah. 1 Peter is kind of interesting because it's, I mean, there's a lot of debate in it on like who's the audience. And I kind of go through it in the book, like outlining who I think it is. I really think that 1 Peter is written to a mixed audience, Jew and Gentile together. And there's a lot of like Deuteronomy 32 stuff in 1 Peter. We talked about a little bit of it there with like the stoicheia stuff. Well, that's 2 Peter, but 1 Peter is really calling this group of people to who are under social persecution because of their commitment to follow Jesus. Whether it's Jews who have been in the diaspora from maybe for generations, been scattered from even maybe the time of the exile, and Gentiles who have left their family religion, I guess, for generations to come into this. They're facing social persecution, and that's kind of like the context of the book. Is Peter is encouraging them within like that type of situation. And now, especially in this area of where Peter's writing, like the empire cult was like huge in this area, like the worship of emperors. Um, and so I think that is like a huge background to it. So those are kind of some of the conclusions that I've come to with a lot of that. As far as like the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, there's a lot about the setting yourself apart to be part of God's community, which is very part of that. Like, so if the world is under the rules of these principalities and powers, then God's community should be set apart in the midst of them in some way, not totally like disconnected from them, but like in the midst of them. There is kind of some his whole section on baptism at the end of like chapter 3 is like really interesting, where it says that Peter kind of employs the almost first Enoch typology of where Enoch in first Enoch goes and speaks to the spirits in prison and pronounces God's judgment as a messenger to them. Jesus, in the same way, like when he went into the grave or at his ascension, people debate that in First Peter 3, goes and pronounces his victory to the spirits who are locked in prison, which kind of echoes back to Genesis 6 and like the whole sons of God, Nephilim stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there is definitely Deuteronomy 32 worldview going on, and that's kind of at the conclusion of like this whole section in the middle of First Peter, which starts with Peter declaring that these people are a chosen race, a priesthood, a set apart people, using all of the Old Testament language of Israel, but applying it to the Jew and Gentile church. And then after that, it goes into these specific situations of, Christians living under kings. Then it goes to slaves living under unbelieving masters. After that, it gives Jesus's analogy, kind of sandwiches as a parenthesis in the middle of that, where it says Jesus was like a lamb to the slaughter, and he didn't make a sound, and like he was vindicated, and all of this stuff. And he's encouraging the believers in these communities to take on the posture of Jesus. And then it goes into a part after that where believing wives under unbelieving husbands. And in that culture, a wife was expected to take the religion of her husband if he was a pagan. And so Peter's not telling them to submit in a way where they would like give up their faith, or give their allegiance, but to win them over by their behavior. And so that's kind of the message throughout all of First Peter is like, let your orthopraxy, like your practice of your belief, outflow from your orthodoxy. And I think that really plays into what we have, because that's kind of the immediate context when we get to First Peter 2 verses 13 to 17, which starts out with submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. I'm reading from the NASB here. It might be different than what you have. I don't know what you have up. Whether to a king as the one in authority, or the one, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God. By doing right, you may silence ignorant fools and foolish men. So again, uses the same words as submit, voluntarily yielding, as in Romans chapter 13, verse 1. That word submission, again, hupatasso. There is a word for obey, which is used in First Peter, hupakaio, which is used for God. But I think we need to pay attention to why we submit, or why there's obedience, I guess you could say. And it says that submission is for the Lord's sake, not for the sake of those who are in charge because of their position, but because it's what Jesus has asked us to do. Mm-hmm. It's what our King has asked us to do. It's not just because of this is what what we do. It's because our king has asked us to do it. We do it because he's our king.
I
Yeah.
see.
And,
So
and I think it.
yeah, no, that's okay. Keep going.
Yeah, I said, and I think that word Lord is also politically charged because it was a word for Caesar as well. He's saying your Lord's sake. It was a term used for Caesar, and yeah, and he's using it for Jesus. A lot of like your translation there says human authorities. Some say human institutions. The Greek word there is katesis, which is usually referred to as a creation or a creature, not an institution. So every human, he said, submit yourself to every basically human creature would probably be the best rendering of it. Joel Green, in his commentary on First Peter, which is an amazing commentary on it, really brings that out and brings up all the different ways that it's used throughout the scripture and how it never means a human institution. Which is interesting that a lot of translations translate that as human institution, though it's not called for as a translation there. The same kind of submission, when it uses submission there, is used in Ephesians 5:21, where it says to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So that's kind of maybe the logic here is submit yourselves for the Lord's sake, because he calls us all to submit to one another anyways. So that's in the context of the church. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. After that, in Ephesians 5, he goes into the whole marriage submission stuff, submitting to one another.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just for some clarity here, so in 1 Peter 2:13-17, so what is there any specific references here that are like or not red flags, but just like big alarms, like, hey, this is referring to some type of divine entity, or is it kind of just in the background? What are your thoughts there?
I think it's just kind of in the background. I mean, the same word authority there, exousia, is used of powers, physical and spiritual. In verse 13 there. I think it's more talking about physical here, but obviously I think there's this view because of all the other stuff that Peter writes, which I have gone through some of it here just a couple minutes ago, and in the book there of connecting the Deuteronomy, that Peter does have a Deuteronomy 32 worldview going on, and so he does see these powers of the governments that aren't Christ's kingdom as being controlled by the powers of the spiritual powers, the hostile spiritual powers. Yeah, and when we get to verse 14, it says the governors who are sent by him. That him there is not the Lord. That him in Greek, I believe, is connected to the emperor, the king, in verse 13. So some have argued in verse 14 that those governors are set up by God. I don't think it stands up in Greek at all. So the governors are the ones who punish those who command and do right. So it's God's will that by doing good, you should silence those who talk ignorantly. So same as Romans 13, he's telling these people to live in an upright way that's a good prophetic witness in the culture. Not necessarily that by being a governor or by participating in government that you're doing what's right. So, so he says to live as free people, so free from this governmental structure because you are part of a different kingdom, but don't use your freedom as a cover up for evil. So he's basically, again, squelling zealotism, rising up against empire, live as God's slaves. So after this, a few sections after this, he gives them the character of Christ that I talked about, of that Isaiah 53, lamb to the slaughter, submitting himself even to human violence for the sake of redemption, mindset that the church is supposed to take on, not paying back evil for evil, but turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, that type of mindset. I love the way that he ends it in verse 17 there. This section is show respect to everyone. Love the family of God. It says to fear God, but honor the emperor. So see, there's a amount of respect to everybody, but there's a special love for God's family. There's a fear or a respect for God, and an honor for the emperor. So you don't have to get the same fear that's owed to God, or honor, allegiance that's owed to God to the emperor. There's different categories for all these things.
Yeah.
When it comes to the kingdom, he's separating the kingdom from the world. Even in this last line, he kind of juxtaposes them. So.
Yeah. So we've kind of hinted at it, seems, but if we were to take the view that Paul has about these entities that are supernatural essentially being in charge, or maybe even possessing, or whatever, it's not explicit about it, but they're being in charge of the human rulers of the age, like Nero, or maybe even local people. Is there any reason to think that the biblical writers or Paul himself would think that the rulers today are not in charge by those same supernatural entities? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a hard one. It's interesting because there are some in the divine council community who will think that, like, at the cross, Jesus defeated all of them. I think the Bible teaches more that they're bound, and we're rescuing or liberating people from these kingdoms into the kingdom of God. That these spiritual beings are still out there, alive and well and in power. And I kind of take that point of view, that the kingdom of God in the churches are God's kingdom presence here on earth. It's like an already but not yet thing. It's already there, and it's something that's spreading. So that's kind of my my point of view on the way that I guess we could see it today. Yeah. I think that Neil Asaya, I don't know if you've had him on your show or not. He has an amazing book called The Politics of Jesus.
Okay.
Phenomenal guy. And he wrote this book where he kind of has he analyzes three approaches of the church to the state. One he calls Christianism, which is really kind of like your Seven Mountain Mandate, Christian nationalist, we need to rise to the top of all these mountains of culture, take them over, have Christian influence at the top, from the top down, and that will transform culture. He has found that more often than not, pretty much consistently, that does not result in any lasting change, but really more results in more corruption than anything else within the church. Then there's the separationist view, which you have kind of the Essenes of those who want to go off in the desert and pray, or the Amish or Mennonite communities, just totally separate themselves from society, which is not, also he has shown that does not produce any lasting kingdom change in the world as well. So he calls for a third way, which he calls prophetic witness, that we're supposed to live in the midst of the culture as a prophetic witness, but not necessarily be participants, senators or whatever like that, like governmental employees, but the church is to live as an active light and witness in the midst of the culture. He said that this is actually, like, in the countries and states that have done this, has produced the least amount of corruption in the church and the most amount of change in their culture. So he's got some good evidence of that, and he's a Christian, not a theologian, but a political scientist who analyzes kind of all of these things throughout, like, church history and the way that they've done it. And it's an amazing book. We've done an interview with him on our podcast. He endorsed our book as well. But
cool.
I completely agree with him, and his research is really good on that. The book is called The Politics of Jesus. I I said it earlier. I'm blinking now.
They can rewind it.
The global politics of Jesus. That's what it is.
Okay.
Politics of Jesus is John Howard Yoder. Sorry, I was mixing up with that. So
okay. Yeah, but everybody should get your book first, and then if you have money left over, then you can get that other book. Yeah, there you go. As you're explaining that, if I were to pick one that looks most similar to what Paul is talking about, it seems the closest one is that third option.
Yeah, the prophetic witness.
Yeah, especially in 1 Peter 2 and 3. That seems to be the goal there in general.
And I think it also is Romans 13 and 12 when you connect those together as well. And that's what I argue for in the book, because I think I argue for that prophetic witness also is the key that would connect, if you don't take a dispensational reading of Revelation, that would connect all three of those passages together.
Yeah. And more back to the question at hand. So it seems to me, and I'm not an expert here, but it seems to me that when we look at what Paul and the New Testament writers are thinking, this is after Jesus has, been crucified, and I guess there's a question of whether he came back or what that even means, or that whole conversation. But either way, they're writing after Jesus was crucified and he resurrected. So if someone wants to say that, hey, Jesus defeated the powers, well, the powers are still working
in place
in Paul's time.
And Paul and Peter and John.
Right. Yeah. So unless if something happened after all of this, after Paul and the rest of the New Testament, that I'm not aware of, then it seems like that whole concept would be alive today, unless if you took a view like something like John Walton, that maybe we're misunderstanding the inspiration idea here. But that's a whole nother conversation.
Or a full preterist approach. We think that Jesus actually defeated them when at the destruction of the temple or something like that. Which I don't take that either. So
but even if you took that view, you would have to argue that something like Revelation was written before 70 AD, right?
70 AD, yeah.
Right.
And
but there are other texts in the New Testament, like I guess there's a whole dating question for a lot of this stuff.
It's a lot of like pastoral epistles and stuff like that.
So you'd have to basically, any reference of these principalities and powers would have to be before 70 AD, which is disagreeing with a lot of scholarship, I'd say.
And even you got some of the governmental texts, like I don't deal a ton with Titus 2, which essentially says the same thing as Roman, because I don't deal with it a ton, because it essentially says the exact same thing as Romans 13 in the book.
Well, thank you so much for all that. So you got a little bit of time left?
Yep.
Okay. So in that case, let's talk about Ephesians 4:8, Jesus descending into the underworld. So there's a number of passages that talk about this. You briefly mentioned either 1 Peter or 2 Peter. I can't remember which mentions it there. But could you talk about how Ephesians 4:8 fits in?
Let me pull that up quick here on my end. So it talks about, Jesus, when he ascended on high, he led a captive of hosts, gave gifts, and that. So
that's Psalm 68:18.
Yep. So Paul interprets it a little differently. You can edit this, right? I need to find my spot.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
It is interesting. Looks like the writer of Ephesians, I guess Paul. There's almost a parentheses in this translation. It says, "What does he ascended mean? Except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions. He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe."
I think first, like the rule of the powers, I think, are broken at the cross, is one thing we need to acknowledge. And many have seen like the cross is Jesus's enthronement, with kind of the backwards images of him having a robe when he's beaten, him having a crown of thorns, him having a scepter of reeds, the royal procession of him carrying the cross, the inscription of the King of the Jews over the cross, throne as a cross, all that type of stuff. And I think this backwards act was not merely like delegitimizing or disarming the powers, but it was enthroning Jesus as the King of Israel, and the King of the world. And like you said, Psalm 68:18 and Ephesians 4:8 speak of the victory of his enthronement, and you kind of read that there. I think we need to kind of notice the differences between what Paul says, or what David says, or the psalmist says in the Psalms, and what Paul says in receiving. Because in the Psalms, it's receiving gifts, but Paul says that Jesus is giving gifts. I think Michael Heiser has a great quote on this, and I'll just read from him. I think to sum this up, Psalm 68 gives us a standard description of conquests known from other ancient texts, even from ancient sculpture and iconography. The victorious captain of an army leads enemy captives behind him. They are his human booty of war. When Paul quotes Psalm 68:18 in Ephesians 4:8, he does so thinking of Jesus. Part of the confusion over how this is interpreted, what Paul is saying, is that so many commentators have assumed captives are liberated in Ephesians 4. This isn't the case. The idea would flatly contradict the well-understood Old Testament imagery. There is no liberation, there is conquest. Paul's words identify with Yahweh in Psalm 68:18. It is Yahweh who is described as the conqueror of demonic strongholds. For Paul, it is Jesus, the incarnate second Yahweh, surrounded by the demonic Elohim, the bulls of Bashan. So he's talking about Psalm 22 there, fulfilling the imagery of Psalm 68. Jesus puts the evil gods to an open shame by triumphing over them by the cross. That's Colossians 2:15. Psalm 68:18 and Ephesians 4:8 are in agreement if one sees conquest. The ancient world, the conqueror would parade the captives and demand tribute for himself. Jesus is the conqueror in Psalm 68. The booty does indeed rightfully belong to him. The booty also, after Jesus conquered his demonic enemies, he distributes the benefits of the conquest to his people, the believers, specifically the benefits of apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, which connects back to kind of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. If you look at the intertestamental view of Genesis 6, it was the fallen Elohim teaching divine knowledge, I guess you could say, to the people, which actually was forbidden knowledge. But instead, he's taking that from them and giving, these people, apostles, prophets, pastors, or shepherds, teachers, distributing like the true knowledge of Jesus, the way back to Eden, essentially.
Yeah. And just for the audience's sake, so this idea of descent into lower regions, do you know much about the Enochian context here? Do you think that's what it's referring to?
It could be. If he's taking like an Enochic background, obviously like the spirits in the lower world who are locked up after the Genesis 6 thing ask Enoch to be the representative and go talk to Yahweh, to beg for pardon on their behalf. Yahweh essentially says no, and Enoch is the messenger who goes back to them and says no, you'll remain in chains. So it definitely could be that. I think that Peter gets at that in like 1 Peter 3, end of 1 Peter 3. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. 1 Peter 3:18-20 says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built." And in the book, the text of Peter references Enoch a lot. So
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
so
he echoes
seems
back to
like
him a lot.
it seems like there's a really high chance that he's referencing Enoch in that passage, and therefore, I guess
Mhm.
putting Jesus in that context, essentially.
Yeah, and I think the ESV inserts a comma between lower regions, comma, the earth, to explain what the lower regions were. So he ascended from heaven to the lower regions, which was the earth, um, and Christ had his victory and led the procession.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. Awesome. All right. And I was hoping just briefly you talk about Matthew 4. So this is when Jesus is in the wilderness, basically tempted by Satan, however you interpret that. And at the
Hmm.
end, uh, Satan says, "Hey, I'm going to give you all these regions or whatever." Could you talk about
Yep.
maybe the context of that for the Deuteronomy 32 worldview?
Yeah. So the temptation in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4, I think has a lot to do with this. Um, it's found in also in Luke chapter 4. I think there's a lot of connection with the story of Israel, where there's a lot of similarities. Joel Green kind of makes a lot of these connections where there's a divine leading into the wilderness, such as Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2. There's uh, the number 40, where it's 40 years for Israel, but 40 days for Jesus. Israel is called in Exodus 4 the Son of God, where Jesus is also in Luke chapter 4. There's a testing of Jesus, which is analogous of a lot of the stuff that Israel experienced in the wilderness, but Jesus overcomes. And through Jesus, Jesus was full of the Spirit, though, and succeeded where Israel rebelled and, I guess you could say, grieved the Spirit. So the devil, Diabolos in Greek, meets Jesus in the wilderness in his 40-day fast, um, and when you look at that, it says the devil led him up in Matthew, actually, chapter 4, onto a very high mountain, which could be significant of when we look at the Old Testament of cosmic geography. High mountains were in kind of the worldview of ancient Israel and the ancient Mesopotamian world, the place where the gods met, of where divine councils were held. Mountains were the place where heaven and earth overlapped. And I explain in the book where Mount Hermon was often one that was, and Mount Zaphon were ones that were described as this, of where the watchers came down in the Enochic tradition and descended to the earth. So in the Old Testament, Baal was also said to rule from the mountain of Zaphon in the north, a mountain from which we notice a lot of people, a lot of scholars think the devil is showing Jesus the kingdoms of the world from there. Um, and the devil says that it has been handed over to me, and I will give it to whom I wish. And the first thing to note is that he says it's been handed over to him. And this connects directly to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where God handed over the nations. It's the similar wording to that which we have in Deuteronomy 32, where the progeny, basically, it's given over to these divine spiritual beings. They lead the nations astray. And I think it's also interesting the thing that the word world here in that passage is oikomene and not cosmos. So oikomene means the world of humanity, quite often is the way it's interpreted, rather than the entire universe. So Satan has the rule over the world of humanity. Yahweh is obviously the ruler of the universe and the ruler over Israel. The second thing to notice is that he says that it's been given to him and he can give it, and Jesus doesn't contest that, which I think is really interesting as well, because Jesus could have just said, no, God rules them all, but he contests it. Yeah. He doesn't dispute that Satan has control over these nations, which really ties into Deuteronomy 32 worldview. I think the third thing is Jesus' answer is, away from me, Satan, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Could that connect? Potentially. I think so, that the rulership of these nations is directly connected to worship of Satan. The quest for power, Jesus says, like when his disciples want to, was it James and John, argue, like wanting to sit at Jesus's right and left hand, essentially be like Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the State or whatever. Like in Jesus's kingdom, he says, not so among you. You don't rule the same way the Gentiles do, exercising exousia over one another. Jesus says that his way is that the last will become first. One must become like a servant to be the greatest in the kingdom. He directly like contradicts the Gentile vision of rulership, the worldly vision of rulership, the satanic version of power over. And so I think that Jesus is doing the same thing, to essentially to take power over, or to rule the way the nations rule is to rule in a satanic way.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense with why he focuses on that.
But essentially, Jesus, like Satan's offering Jesus a way to his mission through a way that won't actually accomplish it. His mission is to reclaim the nations. We see that like he disarms the principalities and powers. Doesn't say necessarily defeats them. That will come at the end, when the last enemy to be defeated is death. As it says in 1 Corinthians 15, when all rules and powers are put under Jesus' feet, 1 Corinthians 15. But here we see that his way of disarming the powers is through the cross. We're seeing Revelation, and we are then pulling people into the kingdom of God, this already but not yet.
Right. Yeah, just real quick. So if just from a real simple reading of it, so it seems like the devil's like, hey, we're up in this really high place that's associated with all these, divine council ideas, and the gods live up here, and they're looking around, and he says, I will give this to you, which is a really odd thing to say if you don't have the ability to give it anything to. And then he says, but if you will bow down and worship me. And so Jesus responds, no,
God alone.
That's not how it's going to work. So yeah, anyways, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been a pleasure. As I said, everybody check out your book. If you're new to the channel, I interview biblical scholars like Dr. Mouzakis, and we talk about the biblical text to help us understand it better. Any last thoughts? Anything else that you want people to know about before we get going?
No, I mean, you can pick up the book on Amazon. You can follow my show, Expedition 44. We got a website, expedition44.com. You can find us on any YouTube, any podcast app. We have the audio there. I really appreciate you having me on. It's been an honor to talk with you. Thanks for letting me share a little bit about my research and our findings. And like I said, most of the Old Testament stuff was written. Well, I wrote most of this as my dissertation, but ran a lot of it past Dr. Ryan, who's my co-host on there, who's a PhD in Hebrew and knows more about kind of that stuff. And I did a little more of the New Testament work on it. So it was a great collaborative effort, and we're excited that we get to kind of put it out there for the world, and hopefully people will learn and take kind of Heiser, who's been someone that Ryan and I have looked up to, take some of his views to the next step is how we see him. So
awesome. All right. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Everybody like and subscribe once again, and I hope you have a good one.